Hello there, sleepy traveler. Let's get comfortable now. Tuck yourself under the covers, take a deep breath, and let the day melt away. We're not in the modern world anymore. Tonight, we drift far back into a time that was as fascinating as it was perilous. The medieval ages. Our topic, something oddly specific and quietly gripping. How dangerous it was to be a baby. Yes, a baby. Sweet, innocent, squishy little bundles of hope. But in the medieval world, oh, being a baby was not quite the cozy, pampered experience you might imagine today. So, let's dim the lights of your thoughts, slow everything down, and gently step into the creaking wooden doors of history. Don't worry, nothing will jump out. This isn't that kind of history. This is boring history for sleep. Welcome to the medieval world, the medieval ages, also called the Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the late 15th century. That's 1,000 years. 1,000 years where life was often short, cold, and, let's say, rustic. There were no smartphones, no hospitals, no antibiotics. Toilets? Well, if you count a wooden hole in a stone floor with a moat below, then, sure. But the most vulnerable people of all? Babies. Tiny, fragile, adorable, yet constantly in danger. The very fact of being born just, getting through birth, was a risk. The moment a baby took its first breath was already a small miracle. Let's start at the beginning. Childbirth. In medieval times, giving birth was not a comfortable experience. It happened at home most often, in a small, dimly lit room. No epidurals, no clean linens, no trained doctors either. There were midwives, of course, usually older women from the village. They had wisdom and experience. But science? Not so much. They might pray during the birth. They might chant. They might use herbs or charms. But even the best efforts often weren't enough. For every 10 babies born, it wasn't unusual for 3 or 4 to die in their first year. And mothers? Many didn't survive the birth either. So, a baby's first challenge was surviving day 1. If the baby survived birth, the next few days were still a test. In medieval thinking, a newborn wasn't quite real until they'd lived a few days. They might not even be named right away. Why? Because so many died so quickly. You see, the first few days were seen as a dangerous in-between. A baby wasn't yet baptized, not yet protected by the church. It was almost like they were, still waiting to be fully part of this world. Sometimes, mothers waited to breastfeed either because of fever or superstition. Wet nurses might be called in. These were women hired to nurse other people's babies. Not always reliable, not always healthy. If a baby couldn't nurse well, it might not live long. Let's talk baby food. Well, let's try to. There wasn't a whole lot of it. Breastfeeding was considered best, but again, not always possible. So what did people do? They made something called pap, a thin mixture of bread soaked in water or wine. Yes, wine, sometimes with honey, sometimes with herbs. Sometimes even animal milk, if available. And if you're thinking that doesn't sound very sanitary, you'd be right. Water wasn't usually clean. Milk wasn't pasteurized. Honey could contain spores. Wheat had bugs. Even eating could be a danger for a baby. If a baby survived a week or two, the next step was baptism. This was considered incredibly important. In fact, so important that babies were sometimes baptized within hours of being born. The fear was that if they died unbaptized, their souls would be lost. Not in hell, no, but in something called limbo, a sort of nowhere land. This led to emergency baptisms. Midwives were often allowed to baptize a baby themselves, just in case the priest couldn't come in time. Even rainwater, if nothing else was available, could be used. The ritual had to be done. There were prayers, of course, but also beliefs about protection. The baptism didn't just welcome the baby into the Christian community. It shielded them from demons, from fairies. Yes, fairies. Because, in medieval thought, a baby could be stolen by fairies. Let's take a quiet little turn into folklore. Softly now, because this part is dreamlike and strange. There was a widespread belief in changelings. A changeling was a creature left in place of a stolen human baby. Fairies, they said, might take away a child and leave a sickly or odd-looking baby in its place. Signs? Crying too much, looking strange, not developing normally. The fear of changelings led to, well, some tragic treatments. Some babies were neglected. Others were subjected to rituals meant to drive the fairies out, like placing the child near fire, or iron, or salt, all believed to scare off otherworldly beings. It's hard to imagine today, but these were real beliefs, deeply felt, and they shaped how babies were treated, how parents viewed them, and what a strange, dangerous world a baby was born into. Baby clothes, baby beds. Medieval babies were swaddled tightly, wrapped up like little burritos in long cloth strips. Why? Because it was believed that swaddling helped their limbs grow straight, and because it kept them still. The cloth could be rough wool or linen, whatever the family could afford. Sometimes they were wrapped head to toe for months. Their cradles were simple, wooden, rocking back and forth, sometimes hung from beams. A lullaby might be sung, but often the mother was too tired. She may have had 5 or 6 other children. She may have been back to work in the fields just days after giving birth. So the cradle rocked, and the baby slept, if they could. Amid the bleating of goats, the buzzing of flies, and the clinking of pots, what could go wrong? A lot. Let's drift gently now into a list, a slow, lulling list of things that could go wrong for a medieval baby. Infections, fever, malnutrition, cold, bad water, dirty cloth, lack of milk, witchcraft, fairy theft, accidental smothering, fire, falling into wells, plague, wolves. That's right, wolves. The world was not safe, not for babies, not for anyone, but especially not for the smallest. And yet, despite all this, babies were born and loved. Even in hard times, families hoped. They smiled when a baby cooed. They lit candles for their protection. They prayed. They celebrated when a child made it to 1 year. to 5 years, to 10, because each year a child survived was a kind of quiet triumph, a soft rebellion against the odds. And maybe that's what made the love even stronger, because every baby that lived was a miracle. And now, dear listener, as you lie back and feel your breath slow, let your thoughts drift gently away from stone walls and flickering candlelight, from wooden cradles and swaddled limbs, from superstition and lullabies sung in the dark. Let the soft rhythm of history rock you to sleep, because even in the harshest times, there were dreams, there was love, and there were babies fragile, hopeful sparks welcomed into the world, one soft breath at a time. Let's float now into the world outside the cradle. Imagine a small medieval village, thatched roofs, muddy roads, chickens wandering freely, a distant sound of someone chopping wood. It is not a quiet place, nor a clean one. It is full of life and death, and everything in between. This is where most babies were born, not in castles, not in palaces, but in humble homes with dirt floors. Most families were peasants. They farmed the land. They worked from dawn to dusk. And children were both a burden and a blessing. You might think, were babies cherished? Yes, but practical love, you see. They had to survive first. There wasn't always room for sentiment. We return now to the women who helped bring babies into the world. Midwives. They were the healers, the birthers, the ones who stood by mothers in pain. They had no formal training, no degrees, no medical texts. Instead, they had experience, passed down knowledge, maybe a few charms, maybe a few prayers. They might use herbal concoctions, chamomile to soothe, mugwort for pain, raspberry leaf tea for strength. But midwives were also watched closely, because if things went wrong, if a baby died or a mother bled too much, people whispered, was she a witch? Had she angered the spirits? Did she let a demon in? It wasn't fair, but it was the world they lived in. One foot in faith and the other in fear. The church was everywhere. And for babies, it meant rules, rituals, and salvation. Baptism, as we mentioned, was a top priority. But there were other teachings. Mothers were often told to stay inside for 40 days after childbirth. This was called the churching of women. Why? To purify them. Because birth was seen as is spiritually messy. Beautiful, yes, but also sinful. It was believed that pain in childbirth was Eve's punishment. From the Garden of Eden, you see. So, even as a baby cooed and a mother smiled, the church's shadow stretched long across the cradle. Let us turn now to illness, because it came often, and it came fast. A baby might be warm one evening and gone by morning. What were the causes? Many. So many, we cannot count them all. But let's whisper through a few. There was the flux, likely diarrhea, deadly when water was bad and food was worse. There were fever sudden and mysterious. There was coughing, vomiting, listlessness. There were rashes and sores. Parents tried what they could. They might hang herbs around the cradle, make a poultice of onion and honey, or say a prayer over the child's head. One popular cure, placing bread on the baby's chest then, feeding it to a dog. If the dog got sick, it had taken the illness. If not, well, try something else. These were times of desperation, but not of indifference. They wanted their babies to live. They just didn't have the tools. Sleep, the very thing we're drifting toward. But what about medieval babies? Where did they sleep? Some slept in cradles, rocking ones, as we mentioned. Others shared the bed with parents. This was both bonding and dangerous. Co-sleeping often led to overlaying. When a parent in deep sleep accidentally suffocated their child, it was so common that laws were passed. In some places, if a baby died in bed with its mother, the mother might be blamed. Still, many mothers kept babies close. It helped with nursing. It kept them warm. And in a dark, cold house, warmth was everything. Let's wade gently into the topic of cleanliness. Because, well, medieval babies weren't exactly sparkling. Diapers, not as we know them. Some families used cloth wraps washed as needed. Others didn't. Babies might be bare-bottomed, or laid on straw, or on a wooden board lined with moss. Washing? Occasional. Water was cold. Soap was rare. Some thought washing babies too much could make them sick. And if the water came from a river, they might have been right. So babies smelled like babies, mixed with a bit of barn, a bit of wood smoke, and a lot of life. Let's whisper about names, because names were important. As mentioned, many babies weren't named until they'd survived a few days. Why? Because loss was common, and naming something made it real. Once named, babies often received the names of saints. Saint Mary, Saint John, Saint Peter. It was hoped the saint would protect the child, or at least recognize them in heaven. Sometimes, babies were named after a parent or a sibling who had died. Yes, it was common for families to reuse names. If a baby named Marjorie died, the next daughter might be named Marjorie too. Not to forget, but to continue. Naming was sacred. Naming was hopeful. Naming was a soft spell. When babies lived long enough, they began to grow teeth. You might think, oh, teething, that's normal. And you'd be right. But in the medieval world, even teething was feared. Fever, crying, drooling, could be the teeth, could be illness, could be spirits. So they tried remedies, hanging wolf teeth around the neck, rubbing ash on the gums, or letting the baby chew on root bark. If a baby fussed too long, some thought it was cursed or touched by the evil eye. So charms were worn, salt was sprinkled, and babies were watched closely. Even their cries had meaning, because in those cries, mothers heard hope or warning. Now, imagine a baby's first winter. The wind howling through wooden shutters, the fire flickering low, the cold creeping in. Winter was the cruelest season for crops, for families, and for babies. Without central heating, homes were cold. Blankets were few. Milk might spoil. Wood might run out. If a baby caught a chill, it could become pneumonia. Or worse, mothers bundled their babies in wool, tucked them under cloaks, even tucked them under beds where the warmth of the earth held steady. Winter took many children, but some, nestled deep in the arms of love, made it through. And every spring after that was sweeter. If a baby lived past infancy, they began to grow into the village itself. There were no strollers, no playpens, no daycares. Instead, babies were carried, strapped to backs, tucked into aprons, held in slings. They watched goats being milked. They listened to the clank of iron from the blacksmith. They felt the sun and the rain and the mud. The village was their nursery, and everyone was watching. Older siblings helped. Neighbors helped. A crying baby was everyone's concern. In that way, perhaps, medieval babies were never alone. Let's wander now into the sounds of the medieval farm. Picture it, a sleeping baby nestled in a basket near the hearth. Outside, the bleating of goats, the clucking of hens, the soft shuffle of pigs rooting in the straw. Animals were a part of everyday life, especially for the poor. But with animals came risk. Fleas, lice, mice, and larger threats too. Sometimes pigs were known to bite children, and rats were common indoors, especially in winter. They scurried across rafters, nibbled at stored food, and spread disease. Cats, though, cats were welcome. They chased the rats, curled up next to sleeping babies, and were often loved deep-lied, despite what later superstition might claim. Let's tiptoe now, away from the peasant cottage. Let's drift up to a stone castle. What was life like for a baby born into nobility? Not necessarily easier, just different. Yes, they had more food. Yes, they had warmer clothing. And yes, there were wet nurses, often multiple ones. But even the rich lost babies. Infant mortality was no respecter of status. The difference was mostly in appearance. The nursery might be decorated with tapestries. The swaddling cloth might be silk, not wool. But the dangers remained. Infections, disease, fire, the cold. One thing aristocratic babies had: records. We know their names, their birth dates, their family crests, whereas peasant babies simply disappeared into the dark of memory. Let us pause here on the figure of the wet nurse. In noble households, it was common to hire a woman to breastfeed the baby, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. This was considered proper for ladies of status. A noblewoman was not expected to feed her own child. It might ruin her figure, some believed, or tire her out. So, other women took up the task. Wet nurses were chosen carefully. They had to be healthy, well-fed, of good character. Some were even tested to see how their milk tasted. Yes, really. But what of their own children? Many had to give them up, send them to relatives or even orphanages, so they could serve in noble homes. And so, a baby in a castle suckled at the breast of a mother, not their own, while the nurse's own baby slept elsewhere. We've mentioned swaddling before, but let's go deeper now. Gently, slowly. Swaddling wasn't just common, it was expected. Babies were bound tightly, with long strips of cloth, from shoulders to toes. Even their arms were pinned to their sides. The idea was simple. Stillness was safety. It kept the limbs straight. It kept the baby quiet. Some babies were swaddled for months, rarely unwrapped. Their little hands never free. The cloth might be linen if you were wealthy, or rough wool if you were poor. Either way became their second skin. Today, we swaddle gently for comfort. Back then, it was stricter, more rigid, more about control. Still, some mothers sang as they wrapped their babies, soft lullabies, soothing prayers, and maybe that made it tender again. This next topic is a quiet one, a solemn one, but let's not shy away. What happened to babies who were orphaned or abandoned? It was more common than we'd like to imagine. A mother died in childbirth. A father went to war. A plague came through the village. And suddenly, a baby was alone. There were no modern orphanages, but there were monasteries and convents. Some churches had foundling wheels, rotating barrels built into the wall, where a mother could leave a baby anonymously. She placed the child gently inside, turned the wheel, and walked away. The nuns or monks would raise the child, or at least try to. Many didn't survive long, but those who did were often given religious names and lived quiet, cloistered lives. Now, let's visit the older brothers and sisters, because in the medieval world, they were not just siblings. They were babysitters, caretakers, helpers. A girl of 6 might be told, "Watch your brother." A boy of 8 might be tasked with feeding the goat and rocking the cradle. There was no concept of childhood as we know it today. Children became useful quickly. And so, a baby's early world often included little hands, tiny protectors, siblings who were still learning themselves. And sometimes, the care was clumsy, but it was care nonetheless. A spoonful of mush, a game of peekaboo, a brother lifting his sister high above the mud. They didn't know they were shaping memory, but they were. Back to stories, softly now. Back to the tales whispered near hearths and straw beds. The medieval world was full of stories. Tales to scare, tales to soothe. Babies were often at the center. If a child cried at night, some said it was because the fairies were near, or that a spirit had touched them, or that a witch had glanced too long at them in the marketplace. To protect the child, charms were placed near the cradle, iron keys, bread crusts, red thread. Holy water was sprinkled, Latin prayers were whispered, and all the while the baby slept, or didn't, but around them a world of invisible fears danced, and parents did what they could. A baby's first smile, a first laugh, a first step. In the medieval world, these were quietly celebrated, not with parties, not with cakes, but with hope. A baby who learned to walk was strong. A baby who laughed was healthy. A baby who clapped or waved might just make it through the year. These little milestones were not guaranteed. They were not expected. They were gifts. Some parents marked them in prayer books. Some told neighbors. Some gave thanks to saints. And slowly, ever so slowly, that tiny creature became a child. Now let's zoom out, wider still. What did babies mean to medieval society? They were hope. They were labor eventually. They were heirs. They were burdens. They were blessings. They were risks. A baby born to a noble family might carry the name of a dynasty. A baby born to a peasant might carry water by age 6. There were no baby registries, no baby showers, no parenting manuals. There was instinct and survival and repetition. Each baby entered a long chain of life and work, tied to the land, to the church, to fate. And through it all, they cooed, they cried, they changed everything. Before a baby even entered the world, there were whispers, old beliefs, little rituals. Women tied herbs around their bellies. They placed knives under the bed, believing it would ward off evil spirits. Midwives murmured blessings. Fathers waited outside, with worry stitched into every heartbeat. There were charms made of lead, bones worn as pendants. Saints prayed to. Some believed eclipses could harm an unborn child, or that a mother's thoughts shaped the baby's fate. There were stories of babies born with marks, a witch's kiss, they said, or a sign of a twin that never made it. The line between medicine and magic blurred completely. It was a world of wonder, of worry, and of trying everything when nothing was certain. Midwives were both respected and feared. They held life in their hands. They stitched women closed. They massaged bellies. They whispered prayers. But they also walked a dangerous line. In the eyes of the church, some midwives strayed too close to sorcery. If a mother or baby died, suspicion followed. Were they cursed? Was the midwife to blame? Some midwives were accused of using forbidden herbs or reading old pagan chants. Others were praised for their miracles. Their power was also their danger. They held centuries of oral knowledge, passed from woman to woman, and that made them invaluable, but vulnerable. Surviving the first year was a triumph. Truly, records from some regions show infant mortality rates as high as 30, 40, even 50%. That means nearly half of all babies didn't make it to their first birthday. If a baby did, it was quietly celebrated. No balloons, no parties, just maybe an extra spoonful of mashed peas or a whispered prayer of thanks. The first tooth, the first fever survived. The first winter endured. Each was a miracle. And yet, life was always precarious. Even at 1 year old, even at 2, still, every morning, a baby opened its eyes. Was a morning someone breathed easier? Let's talk about illness, gently, because the medieval world was full of it. There was the bubonic plague, though it mostly affected adults. There was smallpox, measles, whooping cough, and fevers with no name at all. Babies had almost no immunity, and when illness swept through a village, they were often the first to go. Doctors, when they existed, were mostly for the wealthy But even they couldn't cure much. And so, mothers turned to what they had: cool cloths, herbs, honey, prayer. Some burned incense to clear the air. Others tied garlic around the crib. They did what they could, and hoped, and watched, and wept. In the medieval mind, the soul was always close. And for babies, that made things complicated. The church taught that babies needed baptism to be saved. Otherwise, their souls might wander. Unbaptized babies who died were often buried in separate graves, outside churchyards, sometimes without a name. There was a belief in limbo, a place, not quite heaven, not quite hell, a place for innocent souls who never had a chance. This was heartbreaking for parents, but they believed it because it gave shape to the grief. It gave meaning to loss. Still, not everyone agreed. Folk beliefs were gentler. Some thought babies became angels, that they went straight to the stars. And so, even in death, the baby's soul became a story. When a baby was baptized, godparents were chosen, a godmother, a godfather. But not just for spiritual reasons. No, they were protectors, stand-ins, sometimes even heirs. If something happened to the parents, godparents might raise the child. It was an honor, a duty, sometimes a burden. And so, the choice was careful. It might be a sibling, or a respected neighbor, or someone with good standing in the village. The bond between godparent and godchild was considered lifelong. In some places, gifts were given every year. In others, it was simply a quiet connection, another thread in the web of care, meant to keep a baby in the world. Babies did play. Of course they did, even in mud. Even in poverty. There were no plastic rattles, no flashing lights, but there were wooden dolls, rag animals, pebbles to stack. A parent might carve a little horse, or sew a ball from scraps of fabric. Even in castles, toys were simple. Miniature swords for boys, tiny spinning tops, carved whistles. Babies loved rhythm, repetition, tickling, peekaboo. The laughter of a baby was the same then as now. A brief light in the dark, a reminder that joy still bloomed. How were babies dressed? Not in onesies, not in matching sets. Most often, they wore simple gown, one long piece of fabric, tied at the shoulders, easy to lift, easy to clean. Underneath, sometimes nothing, sometimes a linen undershift. If the family had means, there might be a small wool cloak for winter, or a cap for the cold. Swaddling was part of this too, so much so that sometimes babies looked more like bundles than people. Shoes? Rare for infants. Their feet were wrapped instead. Colors? Mostly natural beige, brown, faded blue. Bright dyes were expensive, so the medieval baby looked like a tiny monk, perhaps. Quiet, bundled, barefoot, but warm. Hopefully warm. Yes, we must visit this quietest room, because loss was part of life. When a baby died, there were tears, there were prayers, sometimes silence. Funerals were small, graves shallow. Markers were often wooden, soon lost to time. But grief was deep. Some mothers wore black. Some fathers planted trees. Some families simply never spoke the name again. Others remembered in whispers. This would have been your brother's birthday. She looked just like you. Some babies were buried with a scrap of cloth, a toy, a saint's medallion. And though the world moved on quickly, the parents never truly did. Grief lived in the walls, in the lullabies sung to other children, in the quiet gaze into the fire. After a loss, sometimes came new life, another baby, a new hope, a second chance. But the fear never left. Parents watched the new baby closely, checked its breath, listened for cries, feared quiet too long. Some believed in changelings, that a fairy had stolen the first baby, that this second one was protected. So charms were placed at the windows, salt lines drawn, iron nails hammered near the door. Love was stronger. So was fear. But still, they held on, held the baby, rocked it, named it, and hoped. What did a baby sound like in the year 1250? What was their first word? Not mama, perhaps. Not always dada, but something equally tender. A bubbling syllable, a gurgled attempt at connection. Medieval parents waited, just as we do. Listened, leaned close, smiled. They might call a baby my little lamb, or sweet chick, or my treasure. When the first word came, whenever it came, it was met with delight, no matter the language. Latin, French, Old English, Middle High German. It was all music. Some babies spoke early, some late, some never. But the parents always waited and loved them anyway. Teething was its own trial, even in the Middle Ages. Swollen gums, fever, crying that wouldn't stop. Some believed teething itself could be deadly, and sometimes, when other infections struck at the same time, it seemed to be true. To soothe the pain, parents used wooden beads to chew, pieces of root, cold rags when they could be made, sometimes even coral. Coral, yes, a teething charm of the nobility, thought to be protective and cooling. There were even tiny silver bells rattles with both sound and bite. Still, in cottages and castles alike, mothers rocked, sang, hummed low, rhythmic notes to ease the pain, and the baby cried and clung and slept eventually. Names. How were babies named? Sometimes after saints, sometimes after ancestors, sometimes after the season in which they were born. Names carried weight. They could reflect family duty. They could signal religious devotion. They could honor someone recently lost. In France, you might hear John, Marie, Etienne, Isabeau. In England, Agnes, Edmund, Matilda, Walter. In Italy, Giovanni, Lucia, Marco, Chiara. Baptism often came within days of birth, sometimes the same day, especially if the baby seemed weak. The priest poured the water, spoke the Latin words, and gave the child a name. And from that moment on, they were known. Now let us speak softly of sleep, for babies, and for those rocking them. The cradle was a centerpiece, sometimes carved by hand, sometimes handed down through generations. Wooden, low to the ground, curved like a boat. Some were suspended from rafters, hung by ropes to swing gently. Others sat on arched runners, moved by a toe, a finger, a breeze. Babies were wrapped and placed inside, covered with wool or linen, sometimes a bit of fur. Sleep came slowly, or not at all. There were lullabies, soft chants, the murmur of a mother's breath, the creak of wood, the snap of fire, and in that rhythm, sleep finally arrived. Babies needed more than blankets. They needed protection, or so many believed. Saints were called upon for their help, especially Saint Nicholas, protector of rib. It wasn't just faith, it was armor. Invisible armor for the most fragile among them. In moments of fear, parents prayed, even if they hadn't in years. The saints were always listening. Discipline and babies? Yes, even then, children were expected to behave from a young age. By age 2 or 3, rules were introduced. Quiet in church, respect for elders, stillness during meals. Some households were stricter than others. Nobles were taught dignity and formality. Peasants were taught obedience and labor. But for babies, discipline was less about rules and more about expectations. There was an urgency to grow up, to contribute, to learn quickly. But in those early years, most were allowed softness. Most, because a smile was always disarming, even for a stern father. Weaning was gradual, often around age 2. Sometimes later, bread soaked in broth, mashed peas, porridge, milk if there was a cow or goat. There were no baby spoons, no high chairs. A mother might scoop food with her fingers or feed from a shared spoon. Sometimes the food was pre-chewed. Yes, passed gently from mouth to mouth. An old instinct, a practical one. Rich babies had more variety, sometimes even pureed meat. Poor babies had grains, roots, whatever was in season. The first tooth changed everything. The first bite into something solid was another milestone, marked quietly, loved fiercely. A baby's world was not child-proofed. The hearth fire always burned. Knives hung low. Animals wandered freely. Buckets of water stood uncovered. Ladders leaned in corners. Carts rolled by. And yet, babies survived. Many of them. How? Older siblings helped. Parents were alert. But most of all, they simply adapted. A baby learned quickly not to touch the fire, to keep clear of hooves, to stay on the blanket, to listen for warning tones. Still, there were accidents, falls, burns, choking, and every parent lived with a quiet dread and a quiet hope. that their baby would be one of the lucky ones. Let us end this batch with lullabies, because even in the harshest times, there were songs, soft ones, repetitive ones, melodies hummed over and over. Some were wordless, just sound and breath. Others were in Latin, dormi, dormi, filio, sleep, sleep, little son, or in the vernacular, bye, baby bunting, though it may have sounded different centuries ago. Mothers sang while rocking, fathers hummed while pacing, and the baby eventually slept. And in that moment, the world was still, the fear faded, and love pure and patient hovered like mist. In the medieval world, a baby didn't just belong to the parents. They belonged to the village. Neighbors watched over them. Grandmothers offered herbs. Older children brought water. Even the baker might peek in just to smile. In small villages, everyone knew the baby's name. Everyone noticed if the baby cried too long or didn't cry at all. A newborn was news, a celebration, a warning, a reminder. The village held the baby gently, even when it didn't seem like it. They were all part of the same woven cloth, tight in some places, frayed in others, but connected, always connected. Sometimes a baby was left behind. It's a hard truth, but real. Sometimes a mother died. Sometimes poverty bit too hard. Sometimes the baby was sick, or unwanted, or born outside marriage. There were places they could be left. A monastery, a church step, the home of a kind widow. And later, by the 12th and 13th centuries, foundling homes, no questions asked, just a place to be taken in. In some cities, a turntable in the wall allowed a baby to be passed through, unseen. It was sorrowful and quiet, and full of love, too, in its own way, because sometimes letting go was a final act of care. As towns grew, so did the number of orphans and foundlings. By the late medieval period, some cities created formal systems. In Italy, Florence, for example, there was the Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents. It took in abandoned babies, clothed them, fed them, baptized them. Wet nurses were hired, records were kept, and the babies were given names, often with sad little clues like innocent, gift, or hope. Other towns had similar places, though many were overcrowded and underfunded. Still, it was a sign of something bigger, that babies mattered. Even the forgotten ones, even the quiet ones. The stories people told at night said a lot. Fairy tales whispered warnings. Don't go into the woods. Don't follow the lights. Don't stray from your mother's side. There were changelings. Fairy babies swapped with real ones. If a baby cried too much, or looked strange, or grew sick suddenly, some believed a sprite had taken their child. To stop it, they used iron scissors near the cradle, left salt at the windowsill, hung garlic, said the baby's name backward. These stories weren't just superstitions, they were grief and helplessness turned into stories, a way to give shape to what couldn't be explained, to what hurt too much to hold directly. The difference was vast. but not as much as you'd think. A royal baby had a wet nurse, a nursery staff, silk swaddles, gold-threaded cradles, blessings from bishops, chroniclers to record every hiccup. But still, they got sick. They cried. They died. No amount of luxury could prevent that. A peasant baby had a dirt floor, a cloth bundle, a mother with tired eyes, a shared bed, a wooden bowl, but also songs, warmth, and the sky above them. Both babies needed the same things: warmth, milk, love. Both could be taken too soon, and both were mourned deeply. Older siblings mattered, especially in larger families, especially when parents were busy. A 5-year-old might rock a cradle. A 7-year-old might feed a baby broth. A 10-year-old might carry them down muddy paths. They were caregivers, playmates, little protectors, and sometimes the first to grieve. Many grew up watching babies come and go. They learned not to ask questions. They learned to be gentle. They learned when to stay quiet. But they remembered the giggle, the soft grip on a finger, the night the fever came. Siblings were part of the baby's life, and the baby, forever part of theirs. For every baby, there was a gamble, a risk. Pregnancy was dangerous. The mother's body bore the burden. Without much knowledge, without control, no ultrasounds, no sterile tools, no prenatal vitamins, just hope, prayer, midwives, and luck. Bleeding could mean death. Labor could stretch for days. A breech birth could kill 2 lives. And yet, they kept trying, because each baby born was a possibility, a thread in the future, a spark in the darkness, and even the pain carried purpose. Some babies were nursed by their mothers, others by wet nurses, especially in noble homes or among women who worked long hours. A wet nurse was another mother, temporarily, or sometimes entirely. She lived with the child, fed them from her own body, rocked them, soothed them. The biological mother stepped back. The wet nurse stepped in. Some babies bonded more with their nurse. Some called her mother first. This could cause pain, or be accepted quietly, or both. But either way, that baby drank love with every drop of milk, and that mattered more than titles. Every now and then, a baby simply thrived. They didn't get sick. They ate well. They grew round-cheeked and pink. They laughed often, and the village noticed. The parents relaxed slightly. The future peeked through. He's a strong one. She'll make it. Look at those legs. It was whispered, like magic, as if saying it too loudly might scare it away. But hope lived in those babies. They were the candles that stayed lit, the roots that took hold, proof that sometimes, in a hard world, life chose to stay. Let us end this batch with small miracles. A baby learning to sit, a baby's first laugh, the way they followed a finger with their eyes, the curls behind the ears, the weight of a sleeping child on your chest, the smell of their skin milk and earth and time, even in war, even in famine, even in plague. There were these moments. Every day, a miracle. Not loud, not public, just there. Soft, sacred, enough. In a world without hospitals, midwives were everything. They came by candlelight, through mud, through snow, in the darkest hours of night. They carried herbs, cloths, whispers, and the memory of many, many births. They'd seen breech babies, twins, cord-wrapped necks, stillness. They weren't always gentle, but they were steady, and steady was often what mattered most. They said things like, "Breathe, push now, it's almost here," or, "I'm sorry." Midwives held life and death in their hands, and every baby they caught, every slippery, squalling miracle, was a victory. Birth was full of mystery, and mystery invited superstition. People believed if the moon was full, labor would be easier. If a cat crossed the threshold during labor, the baby would be born with lucre, a curse. If the wind howled during birth, a restless soul had entered the world. That charms under the bed could protect both mother and child. Amulets were tied to ankles. Bread was baked with special herbs. Knives were placed under pillows to cut the pain, and Saltaway's salt was kept nearby. Because salt was old and pure and protective. Every superstition was a thread in the safety net, and mothers clung to them. Because hope often wore strange clothes, twins were rare and feared. People whispered that twins meant divided souls, or a blessing, or a curse, or both. If they were the same gender, perhaps less dangerous. If a boy and a girl, some believed the girl had stolen strength from the boy. Midwives had little knowledge of multiple births. Many twins were born too early, too small, too silent. But sometimes they both cried, and two tiny cries could fill a whole village with awe. Double the fear, double the work, double the joy. In a world so harsh, two living babies, a miracle squared. As babies grew, they crawled, and the world was not kind. There were pigs, chickens, dogs, cows. Most were harmless, but a sudden kick, a curious peck, a startled bite could change everything. Fire pits were always burning, buckets were always filled, wells were uncovered. A single tumble could end a story before it was written. That's why babies were tied, sometimes to a post, or a tree, or a sibling, not cruelly, just carefully, to keep them here, on this side of safety, because in a world with few walls, the dangers walked freely and watched quietly. Faith wrapped around a baby like a second swaddle. The first bath might be holy water. The first sound might be a whispered blessing. Baptism wasn't optional. It was urgent. Unbaptized babies, they feared, could not enter heaven. Some believed they wandered in a gray space, limbo, neither punished nor welcomed, just waiting. So baptism was rushed, even done at home, by anyone, in an emergency. Just a few drops of water, a name, a whispered prayer. Other rites came later, a first confession, a first communion. But baptism, that was the door. A baby, once baptized, was protected, no longer anonymous to God, named, known. Even after the cradle years, danger loomed. A cut could become infected. A fever could burn too long. A fall from a low wall could lead to a funeral. There were no antibiotics, no emergency rooms, just salves and hope. Diseases like whooping cough, measles, dysentery, pox of many kinds, could sweep through a household and leave silence behind. Some children recovered, many didn't. Parents watched their toddlers with both pride and fear. Every strong step was a relief, every cough cause for prayer. And still, they played, they laughed, ran through mud, chased chickens. Life demanded it. Some women lost many babies, one after the other, or every other. They cried quietly, then tried again, because trying was surviving. Others lost one and never tried again. Some carried grief like stone, others like vapor, always present but invisible. There were no grief counselors, no support groups, just time and repetition and whispered names during prayers. Mothers kept going. They worked. They nursed others. They raised the living. But they remembered, always, the babies that came and the babies that didn't stay. In medieval manuscripts, babies appear in the arms of Mary, on the margins of holy pages, swaddled like scroll, round and soft with big eyes. They symbolized purity, fragility, hope, the beginning of something divine. Artists painted Jesus as a baby more often than as a man, because even the divine began small. Scribes doodled little infants beside saints, tiny creatures with wings, holy cherubs. Babies in art were not just decoration. They were the point, the fragile, made sacred, the beginning celebrated, the reminder that even kings once cried for milk. A sick baby needed healing, but medicine was sparse. So mothers turned to remedies like chamomile for teething, honey for coughs, though risky, poppy syrup to help sleep, warm ash poultices for swelling, rose water for fevers. Some rubbed garlic on tiny feet. Others sang healing songs over the crib. Some used astrology, checking the stars before administering a cure. There was logic and magic and prayer, all mixed together, because when a baby suffered, the whole house ached, and everyone tried, even if they didn't fully understand. And then, sometimes, a baby simply lived, through winter, through fevers, through teething, through bad omens. They crawled, then walked, then ran. Their mother breathed easier. Their father smiled more. Their siblings laughed louder. A baby who lived changed the whole rhythm of the family. Suddenly, the future returned. A reason to plant more, to build a second cradle, to tell more stories. There was dancing, a bigger portion of stew, a name carved into wood. Not all lived, but when one did, it mattered so deeply. so loudly, even in a whisper, we end here, not with a royal baby or a sainted one, but a common child, unrecorded, unnamed, but very real. Their mother rocked them. Their father shielded the door from wind. Their siblings whispered to them. Maybe they lived, maybe not, but they were loved, and because of them, we remember. The soft sounds, the lullabies, the dangers, the miracles. Medieval babies did not have easy lives, but they were not forgotten. They mattered in their brief, precious way. And now they rest, and perhaps so do you.